Welcome, everybody, to episode 57 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager, one of the regular hosts of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm not joined by Thomas Smith. Thomas is off again this week, but I'm joined by the great Tej Seth. Tej, data scientist now at Sumer Sports. Previously, you were always a data scientist at Sumer Sports, but now you are full-time. You are a University of Michigan graduate. You are joining us here, Tej. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really surprised. We worked together at Pro Football Focus. We now work together at Sumer for the last couple months. That this is the first time we're ever podcasting with each other, just us two, no one else involved. I think you would think by now that we would have done one of these, but I'm really excited for this today.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of all the other times we broadcast together. I think you came on during the Matthew Stafford first ever playoff win for Stafford when we used to do those live watch-alongs when we were both at PFF. And then we did the Super Bowl preview. We did another preview with Parker. But yeah, just the two of us. This is going to be a lot of fun, I think, as we sort of allow people to trickle in. One thing, as people come in, I just want to ask everybody, please subscribe to our podcast on basically Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you look, and then on YouTube, where we are going to post shorts to this podcast, so a little breaking this up into little bite-sized pieces, as well as the entire podcast, youtube.com/Sumer Sports, and on Twitter at Sumer Sports, because you can get this live up there as well. Tell a friend, because as I say on the podcast when Thomas is here, when we get big, you can tell everybody that you were here first, and actually tell the truth about it. I want to talk today about coaching, because both of us have done some work in coaching. And in fact, there's a debate going on right now on Vikings Twitter, for example, who the better quarterback was, and how can you possibly untangle. And in fact, on Sumer Sports, on Sumer Sports Twitter, twitter.com/Sumer Sports, you posted a graphic with Patrick Mahomes and other quarterbacks beneath him and EPA on expected pass plays. We'll talk about what expectation means in a second, but there's this raging debate going on in that, and I, unlike my personal account where I have replies muted, I literally have to try to actually get replies. On Sumer Sports Twitter, I leave those things open, so I know what people are saying, and there's a ton of questions about well, how do you even know that Patrick Mahomes is good, or is he just a product of Andy Reid? How do you know that Sam Darnold is not good? Is he just a product of all the bad coaches he's had over the course of his career in many's minds? I do think, to really understand these things, you have to untangle them properly. And that takes some, I think, statistical firepower and some real design as far as what the question is, Tej.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think so. I think it's really hard to untangle coaching, play calling, and quarterback play, or any position level play for that matter. And that's why when we work with someone like Patrick Mahomes, we've never seen him without Andy Reid as his head coach and as his play caller. So we don't know what it will look like. And I think another example of this is Jimmy Garoppolo. We only saw a very limited sample size with Jimmy Garoppolo with the Patriots a couple of years ago. We saw him just with Kyle Shanahan as his play caller and a pretty good supporting cast from there on out. And he ranked top 5 in expected points added per play basically every season he was fully healthy as a starter. But a lot of people wouldn't have Jimmy Garoppolo in their top 5 quarterbacks. So this year is going to be a test to kind of see how that metric holds up when evaluating him. But we don't get that for every quarterback. Not every quarterback changes scenes and gets a new head coach and gets a new play caller throughout the years.
Yeah, we got that opportunity last year for one quarterback who was very popular in the minds of a very, in my opinion, intelligent fan base in the Seattle Seahawks when Russell Wilson left. He went to Denver. Nathaniel Hackett, who had previously called plays in Jacksonville, did not call plays in Green Bay, but was the offensive coordinator for when Aaron Rodgers won the MVP a couple times. So there was it wasn't this bottoming out as far as support for Russell Wilson. He had Cortland Sutton, he had Jerry Jeudy, he had guys like that as well, and things went really badly. I think some of it was injury. I think some of it was just, we have to take a look back and say, well, is there signal in what coaches are asking a player to do? Because very clearly Pete Carroll was sort of protecting Russell Wilson from some of the things that could have gone wrong for him. And the entire time, we're sitting there and we're wondering kind of, what is there, can we untangle these things? And it's such a hard problem because there's selection. We don't have Russell Wilson pre Pete Carroll in the NFL. We have him post. Now, there's a ton of different things that we could say. We could say it could be aging, could be injury, but at the same time, I think I'd like to be able to say no. Actually, Pete Carroll did a pretty good job of sort of nurturing Russell and keeping him within the confines of the team expectations, and he flourished in that. And sometimes that's hard to admit when you like a player maybe more than his fundamentals would actually suggest liking him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's just such an information advantage when you're the head coach of a team compared to like us analysts that aren't around these players every day, where Pete Carroll might have understood better than anyone out there that Russell Wilson playing at a very high pass rate where they're dropping back and passing on 65% of their plays relative to a more conservative 55% would hurt him because of the way defenses would play against him. And that's why we saw the Seahawks run the ball more than teams with other so-called elite quarterbacks have in the past. But then we kind of saw that play out with they let Russell Wilson kind of open up the doors in 2021, and it worked great for 8 weeks until they ran into the buzzsaw of the Rams defense that year, and it kind of got figured out from there. And his career really hasn't been the same since. So you can kind of see that the trade-off that these coaches have to make, where they want to show their players that they have value in them, but you're also seeing that these coaches know that these players better than anyone else, and it's a lot easier for them to make these decisions than us. It's not to say that they don't necessarily get things wrong as much as analysts do, but they just have such an advantage being in the building every day and creating these teams that can give them this information advantage over other analysts.
Yeah, there are So you bring up such a good point, and where it's so hard to sort of make progress here because let's start with like the very simplest one. And I say simple. I don't mean to diminish this. By the way, we really appreciate Darius. Hell yeah, caught the live show. We really appreciate you for being here. One of our good friends, Matt Ungashek. Damn it, did I miss the ad read? You did not miss the ad read. We will, we will read the first ever ad on the Super Sports Show momentarily. However, yeah, because it's so interesting, right? I was talking to somebody I respect greatly, Ethan Young, who is I think director of player personnel now, or maybe he's even called general manager now for UCLA football. One of the smartest football minds I know, and he came into the PFF office, probably 5-6 years or 4 or 5 years ago, and we were talking about kickers, and he's like, "You just don't have that much information about kickers, but we have them every single day. Like we can see, okay, left hash." He went 10 for 10 today. And you think about, like, let's say a kicker kicks 4 days a week in practice and then kicks in the games. Like, you probably have conservatively 4 times more information than schmucks like us do in game. But then that information, of course, doesn't have some of the covariates and stuff that will be given to data. So there are very clearly situations where we just don't have all the information. And then there's very clearly situations where the math is very definitive on something and teams have gotten it wrong for a long time. And we're finally starting to see them get it right, but there's still a lot of meat left on the bone. So, about 6 years ago, there were 0 NFL teams that went for 4th down when they should have more than 50% of the time. And, I think about that, and I think, and again, these things, mathematical modeling, I think that you can poke holes in some of the models, but I think that they're pretty sound. Now, more than 50% of the teams do that. So you very clearly they were very clearly wrong for a long time, and have come to become right. And that's something you can evaluate. And that's something you could say, like, look, this timeout's worth this much, this 4th down's worth that much. But then there are other places where I'm not necessarily clear. I'm not necessarily all that. I don't necessarily know if we're, as an analytics community, really ready, to make declarations about a guy. Like take Shanahan, for example. A lot of my coaching metrics at PFF like Shanahan, but not like top tier guy because he ran the football too much. But why is he running the football too much? He's running the football too much because he's got a quarterback who maybe can't handle a pass rate that's too high, right?
Yes, no, that's a great point. I think there's so much signal in volume, and it's like when you're walking on the street and there's a long line out of an ice cream store, you're more likely to stop at this ice cream store because the people in line probably know something that you don't know. Maybe the ice cream's really good there, you've never been there. But I think it goes back to that where they know their players much better than we can know their players, but we can know about team building concepts and overlying league trends. And I'm not going to say better than the teams, but as good as the teams, and be ahead of that more than the teams, because when the teams get in their week to week grind in the season where they don't have time for anything else, and then they have to prep for free agency, prep for the draft, that's time that outside analysts who don't work for teams can spend researching things like going for it on fourth downs or positional value. And that catches up to the teams eventually. Like we've seen them adopt a lot of the things that analytics people have been saying for the last couple of years. And that's kind of this new era of the NFL. But just from a pure player to player level, it does seem like that information that they have inside the building, whether it's the kicker point that you brought up just from a play level or the mental health aspect of things, really helps them make these roster decisions when we don't know about that type of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Whether or not Tony Pollard can, take on the entire role. Like I think most of us believe Tony Pollard's better than Zeke, but there's some signal in the fact that they use Zeke more. Whether or not that signal is validated remains to be seen. But there were multiple coaching staffs that used Pollard with fewer carries than Zeke did. Let's go through some sort of like I think cornerstone problems. So for example, I think in college football, the question of how good a coach is maybe easier because as our colleague Parker Fleming talked about, and by the way, Tej brought up something really cool. Like last podcast episode, Parker Fleming talked to Adam Vonderhaar, a guy that works for us at Sumer as a data scientist, much like Tej, who used to work for Dallas. And if you want to think about what or listen to what goes into being an analyst for a team, that's a very good podcast. But Parker talked, he's talked to us, I think, privately about, when you get to pick the players, it's probably easier to evaluate the coaching because the coaching, especially when, you're deep into a run. Now there's some selection bias here, but when you're maybe 2 or 3 years into your tenure as a coach, you've not only gotten to call the plays, but you've also gotten to pick the players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you're a college football coach, since you get to pick the players and control everything that happens inside a college football program, you can use a synthetic control model Parker has used to model out if we put an average head coach in here, how many wins would we expect Alabama to have compared to Nick Saban from the time it went over, and then we can get Saban's wins added per year. And when you apply this to NFL, it's really hard, right? Because we don't know how much control a coach has over the roster that they're building. So if you want to just evaluate a head coach, you have to make some assumptions. There's the Bill Belichick's of the world where a coach can also controls the roster, and that's a little bit easier to evaluate because like how much control they have over the players on the team. But there's also some head coaches in the league where the GM does most of the heavy lifting as they're building their roster. And that's a lot tougher to evaluate how well that coach is doing because we don't know how much their hand is in the cookie jar.
Yeah, for sure. There was a really famous quote. So, there's for anybody sort of looking in, and I love the history of the league. I know Tej, when you set the seed on your R code, it says 1991 because you are a Detroit Lions fan, and that's the last time they won that's the last time they won a playoff game. They won the division in '93. So you obviously can appreciate this as well, but before Bill Belichick, there was Bill Walsh, and there was Bill Parcells, and you wonder, how the selection was there with names. A lot of Williams liking to coach football, but Parcells, obviously was with the Giants. Won a Super Bowl in '86, won a Super Bowl in '90, left. Interestingly, you think about this for all of our Giants fan friends, Jack Jones, Paul Tudor Jones, the Belichick was the defensive coordinator for both of those Super Bowls. And, Bill Parcells won the Super Bowl in 90, but gave it a little bit of time before he left and retired the first time. And so Belichick took the Browns job. If he would have just stayed around a little longer, could have took the Giants job, might have been with the whole butterfly effect of what the league could be. It would be utterly different by then. But, he eventually went to the Patriots, took the Patriots, the Drew Bledsoe Patriots, to the Super Bowl. They lost to the Green Bay Packers. And he famously said, if I'm going to have to be the cook, you got to at least let me buy a little bit of the groceries, is what he said. So even signaling back to those mid 90s Patriots. Now, he was famously let go and went to the Jets. Pete Carroll took over for him in the Patriots, and was about a 500 coach. Made fun of that statement, but in the NFL, it's a very interesting consternation. I mean, we've seen in like Kansas City, for example, there was a legitimate tension between John Dorsey, who rebuilt that team after Scott Pioli left, and when it got there at the end of their contracts, they had to fire John Dorsey and go with Andy Reid. And for the first few years of the Brett Veach era, it was very clearly like a power thing. To the point where now, though, Brett Veach is probably on par with him, given how many good moves he's made and trades and stuff like that. So even within that, it's evolutionary, right? Like Andy Reid's probably the majority of the reason his team is good for the first few years of that era. But now, how much do you factor Brett Veach into it, right? And so there's a really interesting kind of dynamic in the NFL and a modeling dynamic where you almost can't model this definitively unless you have some knobs that you can turn that are non-stationary in time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I think that's exactly what this is all about. Is it's very hard to think about these coaches in the span of, and Matt Ungerschek mentions this, like there are 73 different cookie jars, and this is the specific team building, draft, free agency, roster cookie jar. Is like we just don't know who is controlling that from the GM and from the coach. And that's why it's really hard. So like, that's why I think the way that you approached when you have built coaching metrics in the past, where you can look at things that we think that these coaches control, and we have a good idea of it, like fourth down decision making, 2-point conversion decision making, saving timeouts and not wasting them to delay of games, or even doing more optimal things like increasing play action usage, increasing pass rate if you have a good quarterback. Like all of those things you can kind of put together to create this composite ranking of in-game decision making from coaches, but it's very hard to do the holistic approach.
Yeah, and even then, like, so some of the stuff that we've done, at Sumer, but back when we were at PFF, is take grades, right? And however you want to grade the players, I think like, PFF does a good job. They're not perfect, especially in some positions. And then, or you could just look at Pro Football Reference approximate value, which again doesn't do the greatest job, but and some of the stuff we're trying to develop at Sumer, but like you have to have kind of an idea of how talented the players are. And on a play level, you really have to say, okay, well, if I have this level of talent and I'm facing that level of talent in a league average situation, and again, this is where the modeling comes into place. Like this is where your models, somebody actually, there's a lot of like questions that come from, on our Sumer Sports account on Twitter said expected by whom? Well, we're talking about the mathematical expectation, right? So we're talking about the average or the mean that's generated, or the mean that's being modeled by the models that we're working with. And you just say, okay, well, if these two talent levels are against each other, what would you expect to have happen EPA wise, win probability wise? And there are different reasons why you use either one. Win probability probably comes into play better at the end of games when you're trying to run out the clock and maybe you're preserving a win rather than trying to pick up as many yards as possible. Whereas EPA is probably better in the middle of the game, however you want to do it. But you want to look at that delta, the residual analysis, which is, almost all of analytics. The issue is again, when you do residual analysis in sports analytics, is how much does the entity you're trying to measure affect the expectation in and of itself? And so you have to go in and say like, well, if this guy has like real reign over the roster, then he's influence the expectation, and hence, are you properly evaluating him when taking the residual?
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, and it does really matter what you're trying to model. Like I think a lot of people have modeled wins when it comes to coaching, which is like a fine starting point, but we know because of one score game variance, like how wide of a net wins can just cast on a whole. You can do point differential, but then again, that's very influenced by strength of schedule, even though point differential is a pretty good measure of teams. So it's really hard problem because you have to pick a good response variable to model to begin with. And then you have to think about what influences you want this coach to have on that model. So that's why I think like with what you started with the in-game coaching aspect of things, where we can just measure that one thing in the game, whether it's win probability, like you previously brought up, is the start for evaluating coaches. Like we can see that some of the top coaches in the league in your metric last year and win probability added over expected just from in-game decisions was Andy Reid and Matt LaFleur and Nick Sirianni. Like teams that have had a lot of success have had arguably overperformed their talent level because of coaching. And we even saw Nick Sirianni and Andy Reid being in the top five of this metric and both end up making the Super Bowl. So that's the type of stuff that you want to see when you're looking back at a metric like that. But outside of the in-game stuff, I think it does become a lot tougher.
Yeah, for sure. And even to get an estimate, like I know when you were with me at PFF, like you did a good analysis using basically random effects to look at how much coaches were worth, and in fact, one of your classmates and colleagues, when he was an intern at PFF as well, Connor McQuiston did something similar. It got him on Good Morning Football because he had Tomlin so low, which is interesting, of course, because Tomlin's such a funny figure here, right? Mike Tomlin has and so I want to get back to what I just talked about, but I want to talk about Tomlin to sort of round it out, because Tomlin has only really called plays at the NFL level 1 year. In 2006 with the Minnesota Vikings, he was Brad Childress' defensive coordinator. That year, the Vikings almost set an NFL record for fewest rushing yards allowed, but they were 31st in passing yards allowed because they didn't have a pass rush. And yet, at the same, it sort of reminded me of how like Mike McCarthy's offense in 2005 with the Niners was like the worst in football, and then he got the Green Bay job, and he was a good offensive coach for a while. And so it's sort of funny how even then when we're like measuring these things, production might not necessarily be the best way to measure it. There might be these intangible things. Tomlin goes to Pittsburgh, and Dick LeBeau, who was a Hall of Fame player and a Hall of Fame coach, was running. So he ran the Tampa 2, like the popular defense that the Bucks ran to win the Super Bowl in 2002, that the Bears ran in 2006 to play in the Super Bowl, et cetera, et cetera. He goes to Pittsburgh, where they famously run the 3-4, the Blitzburg defense and everything. And he looks at Dick LeBeau and he said, look, you're better at this than I am. I'm going to be a CEO coach that kind of lets everything happen. Right. And we have a, former colleague at PFF, Bruce Gradkowski, that just said, like, look, Mike Tomlin's like biggest win as the coach of the Steelers was getting Antonio Brown to the stadium every week for like 4 years. And so you have like these like, and so part of me, when I look at kind of like a top-down model for coaching, like I look at Mike Tomlin, I'm like, that's a perfectly reasonable way to model Mike Tomlin, because you look at those rosters, there's not a ton of talent, or there hasn't been for a few years in a row. And I know you could talk about, close game variance and all that, but even after you adjust for that, a guy like Tomlin's going to do really well. And I think it does capture how good of a coach he is. But I think it does because he's not a play caller. Does that kind of jive with your reasoning?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought Mike Tomlin up. I really wanted to talk about him in this discussion because all the other top coaches in the league, you can see where their value comes from almost immediately, just from even watching a couple of games of them. Andy Reid, offensive play calling; Kyle Shanahan, offensive play calling; Matt LaFleur, play calling and in-game decisions; John Harbaugh, very good in-game decision making, has the special teams background. Mike Tomlin, it's so much harder to see where his value comes from because he's not play calling. He's not necessarily using a ton of analytics in his decision making, which is okay because his results have been so good. So I think like when you look at someone like Mike Tomlin, who has never had a losing season in the NFL in 16 years of being the head coach of the Steelers, and has made the Super Bowl twice and won one of them, that's exactly where this CEO aspect of things comes in, where he is the type of coach that can get players into his locker room and have it work better than most teams can do that. And that's why the Steelers can go out and draft someone like George Pickens, who we knew had some type of concerns going into the draft because he was drafted lower than his talent level would indicate. But
Yep.
Mike Tomlin can take him in and make sure that George Pickens is showing up to practice and showing up to the games every day and is able to produce at the high level that he produced at last year, while other teams don't have that infrastructure in place to do that. And that's the advantage that Mike Tomlin provides, but it takes multiple years, or it takes like a lot of studying to really figure out why Mike Tomlin's teams are always so good. And he is the one constant amongst all these teams.
Yeah, and it's amazing, what kind of success he had. I personally think the fact that he got that Steelers team to 18 wins the last 2 years, like that's a whole that like you talk about like we think about like Rod Woodson had 2 Hall of Fame NFL careers, one at corner and then one at safety. I think Tomlin's had like 2 Hall of Fame careers. The beginning where he took the 08 Steelers, won a Super Bowl against the Cardinals, took them to the 2010 Super Bowl, lost a heartbreaker to the Packers. Like kind of that first part where he had all that success, and then now where he's like squeaking out wins against some bad football players. And I don't mean to besmirch. Like Cam Hayward's one of the best players in the NFL. T.J. Watt's a top 10 kind of defensive player in the NFL too. Like, I mean, there are players on that team, but you grade out the talent, and it's not. I mean, these markets are not dull, and they're giving them 7.5 win expectations. So there's certainly I think a lot to be had there. And to your point, like it's this nebulous thing that we have a hard time. And you read any management books, and it's just about that, right? It's about like reaching people. It's about all the stuff you don't see. And like I think Carol, even though our friend and colleague Udit Ranasaria, Seahawks fan, they kind of have this love-hate relationship with him. But there's stuff there too, right? Like there's just stuff where you build a culture, and it's not all about like puppies and hugs. Like that Seahawks team, when he took over in 2011, like they had like the most transactions in football by like 20 or so. And that was like, they're building the culture by iterating on it. And that's something also to sort of take into consideration. We have Frazier here. Hello there. Hi, Frazier. Thanks for coming. And it's, I feel like, what I really like about Tomlin is sort of the same thing we talk about with the it's the same thing we talk about with the Shanahans of the world. It's using what you're good at and trying to just sort of optimize off of that rather than trying to be something somebody else is. And I think that that's really one of the reasons why, Tej, that almost none of the Belichick disciples have been particularly good, because they always try to sort of be Belichick, and Belichick is Belichick, right? Like we're trying to build with our algorithms everything that's already in Belichick's brain. Whereas everybody else is trying to be that person, and you just can't. It's like one of us trying to go out and be LeBron James in basketball when we don't have that talent.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right there. I think I love the saying, you can't replicate the Patriot way because Bill Belichick is the Patriot way. And that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. And I think like, even just from something that like I was closely following, like Matt Patricia's tenure in Detroit didn't work for a multitude of reasons. But the first one was he tried to immediately act like Belichick without having the respect of Belichick, right? Like Belichick gets the most respect of any coach in the league from the players because of his results speak for themselves. And I think if you are a new coach who doesn't have any head coaching experience and you try to act like he does, where he doesn't want to get necessarily attached to his players because he knows that he has to, eventually not re-sign or cut them later. Like I think the recent example is JC Jackson, for example. But you can't do that if you're a new coach. If you were Matt Patricia walking in there, you can't necessarily do that. And that's why it also depends on the longevity of the coach. And I think like Darius in the chat here had a really good question about how many years would you give a head coach before determining to give them the boot or not. And, I think it depends, right? Like Jonathan Gannon is going to get a longer leash in Arizona than Frank Reich is in Carolina, because Arizona is further away than Carolina on the timeline to be competitive. And I think there has to be like there's a range that it gives, but I think after a couple of years you can start to see where a coach is kind of falling. And what I've noticed is when a coach starts to get that win now ultimatum from their owner, that's usually where the beginning of the end begins for these coaches. And I think that's what it comes down to. So that usually happens if like the results aren't working out. Like we think about Matt Rule in Carolina, about 2 to 3 years in is where that ultimatum starts to come in.
Yeah, for sure. And I, it's that, it's weird because, one of my favorite books I've ever read in math and stochastic processes is this book called How to Gamble If You Must. And the scene's out with like this guy who only has like a few $100s to his name and he needs to pay off his debts. And it's like, you can take, more risks, more long tail situations. I feel like most coaches in those situations act in self-preservation, which we know in competitive events is not great when you're not aligned with the crowd. When you're with the crowd, self-preservation is basically doing the conservative thing. But when you are detached from the crowd, you do need to do some things that are a little bit off the beaten path, like trading a Russell Wilson, like doing that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And Pete Carroll was one of those when I talked to my friends in the league, they're like, well, maybe the Seattle job will get open. Now no one's saying the Seattle job will get open because they took a bold move. Same thing with Kansas City. People are like, oh, maybe the Chiefs dynasty is starting to wane a little bit. The trade Tyreek Hill thing works out. I think Brett Veach has a job for life there. If he wants to, speaking of a job for life, okay, Manscaped has a job for life in my life because of all the great things it does, right? We talk about Tej, we talk about tools. We talk about Kyle Shanahan using, Deebo Samuel and using, Brandon Ayuk to sort of pave the way. Of course, Manscaped's a great tool to pave the way for you in your life. Now, they have a 4th generation lawnmower now. Kyle Shanahan's only a 2nd generation amazing coach, which to me, I think Manscaped has already sort of earned your trust there. The Weed Whacker is a waterproof and provides proprietary skin-safe technology which reduces nicks, snags, and tugs in those delicate nose holes. I actually use the one for my nose because, look, I'm getting old, Tej. It's so funny. I'm doing a podcast right now with somebody who is closer to my kids' age than they are to my age. And so, I obviously need, I need some help there. This is a great product. They've obviously really cornered the market on, funny ads and things like that, of course, but it is a very useful tool and they do a good job of constantly building, constantly making the product better, which is a lot of fun. They are the first ever podcast sponsor for the Sumer Sports Show with Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas Dimitroff, former NFL GM, has a Manscaped, set sort of in his office right now. We know that he wants to use it. A big biker, right? And those guys like to take care of themselves. So he'll obviously get a lot of use out of the product. We hope you get uses out of the product. You can get 20% off and free shipping with the code SUMER, SUMER at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com. Use the code SUMER. Unlock your confidence and always use the right tools for the job. Just like the best coaches in the NFL do. Use the right tools for the job at Manscaped, manscaped.com, 20% off with the promo code SUMER. Matt says, we need a Tom testimonial. For one, I'm going to say this because I know Thomas isn't watching right now because I know he's dealing with something right now. Thomas does not like to be called Tom. The closest place to Thomas Dimitroff's heart is to read off his draft picks that he's ever drafted. The furthest place from his heart is to call him Tom. So I'm gonna give everybody that information right now while he's not here. And now you have the answers to the test, which I never gave out when I was a professor, but I'm giving out now. Matt Ungashek says yes. Darius says we're witnessing history right now. Unreal freewheeling ad reads going down at an all-time great. Look, Frazier, former fan of PFF, Eric is managing out to the Palazzolo Manscaped ad reads. Look, I'm not gonna not say that I prep for it a little bit, because again, Manscaped is the perfect, prepping, perfect prepping partner, if you will. So it deserved that here. Tej, one thing I want to talk about as we transition out of that ad read here is how to measure scheme, because we have I think coaching is a few things, right? It's culture. It's sort of that top down, right? So we talk about Tomlin as a top down guy. We don't know where it's coming from, but we know it happens. And so we model it top down. I think about Kyle Shanahan as kind of a bottoms up guy, right? Like we see where he does his thing, right? As far as he's got Garoppolo, not a great quarterback, but they're getting great production out of him. We see that as the reason. So we're bottom up modeling. Yet, so we know how we think we can measure how good a coach is, but I think that there's an edge, and we found this at PFF, and not to give away a little bit of their green line model, that was my green line model before, but if you can measure how different a coach is, and how much they deviate from average, and how much average changes over time and stuff like that, it's a very, I think, useful tool in modeling outcomes and modeling what you think will happen, and also, in my opinion, sort of getting a real gauge on what the league is doing.
Definitely. I think, and that's another lesson you can take from college football, is the more unique schemes are ones that give these defenses more trouble, especially when you have this 1 week of preparation where you're coming off a back-to-back game. These schemes where it's not what you're used to seeing, right? If everyone is living in an 11 personnel world, one tight end, one running back on the field, are you living in a 12, 13 personnel world? And we saw that with the 2019 Ravens, where they really took advantage of all these defenses wanting to defend the craze of the 2018 offenses of the Rams and the Saints, where it was very 11 personnel heavy and they were putting up a lot of points. Defenses were built for that, and then the Ravens put multiple tight ends out on the field, and Lamar Jackson had one of the best seasons we've ever seen, and it kind of worked hand in hand in that. And then again, like going back to Kyle Shanahan, is like he has a very unique scheme because his best receiver, Deebo Samuel, can play running back. His best tight end, George Kittle, can play tight end. And his best running back, Christian McCaffrey, can play wide receiver. And that is very tough for these defenses to defend. And we see that especially like every year with the 49ers, they catch fire during the playoffs because these different pieces have had time to gel, and they can really take advantages of defenses that have been seeing similar looks all year and then have to prepare for this very unique look on 1 or 2 weeks prep.
Yeah, so well said, right? Like it's the 1 or 2 week prep is just so hard. And we even saw it, like, let's push this to the extreme. Tim Tebow won like 7 of his first 8 starts with the Broncos in 2011 after they transitioned. Like that team had Eric Decker, Demaryius Thomas, one of the Fells brothers playing tight end, and they were doing like a normal Kyle Orton throwing the ball offense, and they go and switch on the fly to Tim Tebow. Now, we all some people were doing like the one knee thing at their graduation, but most of us, could tell that it wasn't going to work out long term. But it was such a hard cover. Like when they went to Arrowhead and threw the ball twice the whole game, like it took the Chiefs, by surprise, and it sort of mucked up the game, added variance to your point, and like it can make better teams lose because it mucks up the game and adds variance, and it's a really important part. And when we think about it effectively, like for the modelers, sort of in the audience, like you want to take the data, right? And you want to have as many features as possible. Now with tracking data coming out, this is really cool. But like, stuff that like PFF or SIS will chart, which is like how often do the safeties rotate? How often do you run motion? How often do you run motion at the snap? All these kinds of things. And now the interesting statistical question, right? Or the interesting statistical thing is that none of these things are one variable in and of themselves, right? That's a hard part, right? How often you run play action and how often you run 21 personnel, that's not 2 variables, because those things are intercore. You're going to run more play action if you run more 21 personnel. So you have to kind of build this like this big ass data set. And then you got to smush it down to a smaller data set of principal components. And then basically from there, you want to say, okay, well, how much variance do I want to capture in my model? How far from the league average do I want to look? And then the real interesting question is, if you get a team that is really different from league average for bad reasons, right? They're trying to own the libs running the ball or whatever the heck. How do you deal with that? Because it's still a difficult cover to it's hard to play the Titans every week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though we're not going to say that that's an optimal way of playing, it's still difficult to play them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that kind of goes back to something that has been noticed, for the past couple of years, where offensive coaches that come from offensive backgrounds are having more success in the league right now than coaches that come from defensive backgrounds. You look at the final four teams in the conference championship games of any of the past 2 years, and it's been basically all offensive minded head coaches. And I think even 7 of the last 8 teams last year were offensive minded head coaches as well. And that's because these offenses have more control over the game. And the best thing that you can do for your team from a coaching perspective is getting that really high end play caller that can do a lot of the unique things that you were just talking about. And the easiest way to get that is to just hire that really good play caller as your head coach. And it runs into kind of something that was interesting in Atlanta, where Dan Quinn, after the 2016 Falcons season where they go to the Super Bowl, Dan Quinn as head coach, tremendous defensive coordinator. We've seen that before and after his head coaching stint in Atlanta, but he ended up struggling after Kyle Shanahan left. They did have a good season in 2017, but the rest of the tenure kind of went a little bit downward there. And that's because his offensive coordinator that led Matt Ryan to have the MVP season ended up getting hired away. And we can see that happen to these teams where when sometimes we have this really good coach with a really good offensive coordinator, and if that offensive coordinator gets hired away elsewhere, it's a lot harder to replicate those results in the next year.
Yeah, for sure. And Thomas, Thomas has talked about that before, where, the interesting part is he interacted with an offensive coordinator in Atlanta late in his career. That was an example of what happened, right? Like, in Tampa Bay, they had Lovie Smith and Dirk Cutter, and Dirk Cutter had shown a lot of promise as the offensive coordinator, getting Jameis Winston off the ground and all that kind of stuff. They fired Lovie Smith for really like no reason, right? It wasn't like, it wasn't a, oh, Lovie was doing a crappy job, let's fire him. It was like well, Dirk Cutter's going to leave if we don't make him the head coach, and Lovie Smith's not amazing enough to stop that from happening, so let's do it. I think it's harder when you have success, but to the point, it's almost harder if you don't do it, because we've seen over and over and over again this happen, and it's you're so right. Like, it's funny because the coach of the year oftentimes, and I'm backing off to head coaches, but I think it's instructive. The coach of the year most years is, it's going to be a guy like Kevin Stefanski. It's going to be a guy like Mike Vrabel. It's going to be Sean McVay. If you look at those, they're always coaching those kind of lower level quarterbacks, right? Not lower level, but like, the Jared Goffs of the world, the guys that we know have malleability as far as what their production is. And so then they become the head. And if you look at it, there's always a coordinator underneath that's getting a head coaching job because of that guy, right? And when you become noticed by making a quarterback who's not all that great have great production, but then when you leave, what happens to that quarterback? We see with Mac Jones, we see the sophomore slump. Basically, all the sophomore slump is really just a manifestation of guy coaches rookie quarterback to success, guy gets head coaching job, rookie quarterback struggles in year 2, and it's a perpetuating thing. It's so hard, and it's why, to your point, I want to talk about this briefly before we get to the last thing that you prepped, because you did a wonderful job prepping the show. I would offer 2 first-round picks to the Niners or the Rams for their head coach every single offseason until I got them, because of what you just said. Because look, like, you've done the modeling before. A head coach is worth, like, would you say on average, the best coaches are worth about a win and a half, right?
Mm-hmm.
More or
Yeah,
less.
I'd agree.
So,
Mm-hmm.
you look at a $225 million salary cap, 8.5 wins times 4, that coach is going to be worth about $130 million over the course of that time period, right?
Mm-hmm.
We saw Peyton got paid about 20. Like if you, and this needs ownership too. And this is one of the things where if you trade first round picks for a player like Frank Clark, and you're spending a lot of money for an asset that has a narrower distribution, but you're spending assets and paying a lot under the cap. That cap charge is a problem. If I spend 2 first round picks and then I spend the money to make him happy, that money is uncapped, right? That's an edge you can get over the competition by using ownership to get you a better asset. And now because you're paying you're paying for something that has a narrow distribution, you can buy variance other places if you want to win. So I'm taking 2 first round picks. And the reason I come across 2 first round picks is this reason. So 131 million. I make the surplus value of, and again, surplus value here is just value because they don't cost anything relative to the cap. I understand they cost something to the owner, but again, we're thinking about the owner not having cash restraints. About $50 million over the course of a 4-year stretch is what a first round pick is worth surplus value wise, more or less. Like you can estimate it more. And this is in 2023 cap dollars. So 50 times 2, that's 100. That gets you to that 100. About 31 is going to be what I kind of have to pay him over a course of a little bit. I'm probably 2 first round picks, maybe too much, but like it's kind of in that ballpark there where you go 2 ones and then a salary will get you to what that guy's really worth. And I'm pretty sure I can get those. I'm pretty sure I can convince one of those teams eventually if I keep banging on that door. Like, you think the Rams right now wouldn't take 2 ones?
Yeah, I mean, we know how the Rams feel about first round picks, but maybe they would change
they're
their mind
trying
for
to
that.
rebuild, right? Like,
Yeah,
San Francisco might
but
not take 2 ones, but because they probably know how great their coach is. But like, I would make them turn it down every year. At some point, you got to make them turn it down, don't you?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think 2 ones is the fair price because I think Sean Payton ended up getting traded for a first this year and a second the year after that. So like you can kind of see the compensation for someone like him who probably has less of time left coaching in the league. So if you were to trade 2 first for a Kyle Shanahan, a Sean McVay, or even I think someone that we both like a lot, Matt LaFleur at the Packers, like I think that those are some coaches that you would definitely try to trade the first round pick for, which I think is really interesting. And it goes back to, if you do a trade like the trading for Orlando Brown or trading for AJ Brown or Tyreek Hill, like we've seen these past couple of years, trading first round picks for players. What you mentioned is, it's not only that you're giving up those first round picks, but you almost always have to give them an extension on top of that because they're usually being traded in the last year or the second last year of their current contract, which was the case for a lot of these trades. But for that coach, that extension doesn't have to come into play against the salary cap, right? It only comes into play when you just evaluate these coaches just from an owner's cash perspective, which if you're a GM, I think as long as you get the green light to do that, you should be more comfortable with that.
Yeah, and I know our friends in the league who are listening to the show, of which there are many, will tell us, oh, you're being too naive. The ownership still, you need to convince. It's not just cap and cash. I do think they're right about that, but there are teams namely like Cleveland, Philadelphia is one of them, and Philadelphia, that big edge they have is just like they're not afraid to spend money to win, right? And they're not afraid to push money in the future and all this kind of stuff. And they're not afraid to take chances and let the math play out, but that requires resources. A team like Kansas City is a little bit less that way, right? Like the reason the reason DeAndre Hopkins hasn't been traded for, and the reason that Chris Jones hasn't been signed to an extension is they got a lot of their cash and cap is going to be different than other teams, right? And they can't necessarily go to ownership and be like, hey, we want more money. Now, they'll be able to get, people don't realize this, but the only money that teams get that they don't have to distribute to other teams in the revenue sharing is merchandise and sales at the stadium during games, which the last time the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, they got screwed because in 2020 there was no fans in the games. And so they didn't get the bounty of that, but they will get it this year. There are constraints here, and that's another level. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But we talk about Sean Payton. I wanted to talk about the coach trade because you did a great job of writing up these new coaches. Sean Payton, to me, to Denver, is one of the better moves I think we're going to see, right? Because you're stuck with this quarterback. You're stuck with this asset. And, you weren't able to get out from under it, right? And you're not going to be able to move on from it for a long time. I think Sean Payton's one of the few people in the league that can can do anything with Russell Wilson to make him useful. The last time he was the head coach of the Saints, they went 9-8 with Trevor Siemian starting 4 or 5 games, Taysom Hill starting 4 or 5 games, and Jameis Winston starting, I think, the first 7 games of the season. Jameis is fine, but that whole and Ian Book starting a game. They went 9-8, almost made the playoffs. If the Niners didn't come back in that down 17 in week 18 against the LA Rams, the Saints would have made the playoffs that year at 9-8. They struggled a little bit last year. Quarterback play was off a little bit. I also think, not having Sean Payton was a big deal. And one of the reasons why I bet under for them back when we could bet it when I was working at PFF. I think this is a bang up. I think the Broncos are not being talked about enough as a possible playoff contender in the AFC.
I'm totally with you. And I think it goes back actually full circle to what we talked about at the beginning of the show, where we were saying we wish we got to see coaches unwind, not intertangled with the teams, with their quarterbacks. And we saw that with Sean Payton, right? We saw him have so much success with Drew Brees. I would think arguably a top 3 coach, the last decade. Up until Drew Brees retired there, with Bill Belichick and John Harbaugh and Mike Tomlin and Andy Reid definitely in the top 5 as well. And you saw the job that he did, and then you saw kind of what happened to the Saints, where they pushed chips in the middle to get a better roster without Sean Payton, but it didn't go well, right? They weren't able to get as good of offensive production. They weren't able to win as many games as they were used to with Sean Payton. So you saw his immediate effect of leaving New Orleans, and now you turn to Denver, where they're also in, because of the Russell Wilson trade, they're also in kind of a win now stage where they have pushed these chips to the middle here. And it's going to hamstring them in future years. So that's why you go out and you trade that first round pick that you have for Sean Payton. And I think it should work out well. Like you mentioned, like if anyone were to kind of fix Russell Wilson and do all the things that Nathaniel Hackett wasn't able to do last year, I think it could be Sean Payton, just because of what we saw him provide throughout the different stages of Drew Brees, late career Drew Brees, where his arm strength wasn't as good, but his accuracy was better, or Jameis Winston, and then going on to Taysom Hill, where he had to start multiple games. We've seen him do it with a lot of different types of quarterbacks, which I think should get Broncos fans pretty excited.
Yeah, and a lot of different wide receivers and skill position players too, right? Like he took a basketball player and Jimmy Graham and made him into what he became. And the early years of, Marcus Colston was a 7th round pick that ended up being multiple 1,000-yard receiving player. Devery Henderson, Robert Meacham, Lance Moore. Like they did stuff with guys that they did well. Pierre Thomas. They did well with guys who weren't necessarily like what we would consider to be elite players, and they would always produce elite offense. And secondary to that, like offensive line, they just always did a good job of like Andres Pete wasn't that great of a player, but like they survived with him. And like, I think very highly of Sean Payton as a coach. And I think that defense was so good last year. Now they lose. And I want to go to the Panthers now because they get Ejiro Evero as the coach. David Tepper is another. So much like the Waltons in Denver, David Tepper, the owner for the Carolina Panthers, he spent a lot of money on some coaches this year, right? You go with, Frank Reich was one of those immediate, gets fired, gets a job right away. Like, what was the problem, him or was the problem Indianapolis? They go Ejiro Evero, one of the like really good up and coming defensive coordinators in football. Like if Denver would have scored 20 points a game last year, they probably would have won 11 games. But no one noticed because their offense is so poor. Josh McCown becomes the OC quarterback coach. They're building something cool in Carolina. Bryce Young, of course, is their first round pick, but they do a good job of Adam Thielen, DJ Chark, Hayden Hurst, kind of round them out. Offensive line's okay, bad division. I can see Frank Reich having success right away here.
Yeah, I'm with you there as well. I think, Bryce Young is a different type of quarterback. We haven't seen him necessarily work with someone who has his skill set and his build before. He was so used to working with these taller, more pocket passing quarterbacks in Indianapolis. But I think a lot of people who like really study the game of football and are known for grinding a lot of film, like they have a very high respect for Frank Reich. Like they think he does a good job. And you look at the personnel that he had in Indianapolis, it was fine. Jonathan Taylor had a great year, and Michael Pittman is a good receiver, but they never really had that like all-star receiving cast. And he worked with a lot of journeyman quarterbacks as well, Jacoby Brissett and Carson Wentz and Phillip Rivers at the very end of his career. And so you can kind of see that there is probably going to be a bump in the production that you would expect if Bryce Young were to get like an average head coach. You would have to think that on the offensive side of the ball, Frank Reich is probably better and could take advantage of that weak division like you mentioned.
Yeah, for sure. And I know one big, we talk about this in our field, but like Frank Reich was one of the better decision makers when you look at fourth down, timeout avoidance, delay of game avoidance, all that stuff. He was one of the league's best. And then once things got a little touchy in Indianapolis, he started to wane. Like you look at, you look at sumersports.com, you can go ahead and search that. But like, he's a great example of somebody who I think is very open to some of the stuff that we would like a coach to do. In fact, one of my best friends in the league, John Park, worked for him for a while. George Lee actually went from Indianapolis to Carolina to be his coordinator, a longtime person in the league. Like they did a lot of very awake stuff about, in-game stuff. And then as things kind of got touchy there, you started, and then even once they let him go, Jeff Saturday is like, oh, I'm not going to, or maybe it was Irsay who said like, oh, he's not going to be afraid. He's not going to use the analytics. It's like, desperation makes bad decisions. I hope that now he's in Carolina. He's in a stable situation. There are realistic expectations for them. There are realistic expectations of the quarterback, which they were never able to get right. And in fact, I don't blame him much at all when you're preparing to have one of the best quarterbacks in the league be your quarterback forever and ever, amen, and then he retires, it causes some issues. I think that Frank Reich will have a good career in Carolina. And it was really funny because Frank Reich was the first ever quarterback to start a game for the Panthers. People don't remember that. But in 1995, he started for them for their first few games before giving way to Kerry Collins, their first ever draft pick. Okay, Cardinals. Let's go through these last few quickly. Cardinals, Jonathan Gannon. I'm interested here because in the 2021 season, Jonathan Gannon got a lot of crap from really smart people. Shael Kapadia with The Athletic said this all the time. And it came up when I was doing KPI analysis with Thomas, actually, before either one of us were with Sumer. That 2021 Eagles defense did not do a lot of unique things. They did not do stunting. They did not do coverage disguises. They did not blitz much. They didn't do much. They just kind of sat back and like tried to muck the game up with variance. And I thought it made a lot of sense because they weren't talented. And then last year they get Reddick, they get Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, they get James Bradbury, they get another year of Darius Slay. They get people into the building, right? And funny, they lead the league in sacks. They are much more creative. So Gannon gets a head coaching job, and he goes to a place in Arizona where I'm not breaking any ground here. They're not talented on defense. And so do we wonder how he's going to do because he doesn't have the tools for the job? Like we talk about the Manscaped read. He doesn't have the tools for the job here. Is he given enough time to sort of build it up himself along with Monty Ossenfort, or is he set up to fail in Arizona?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, promo code Sumer on Manscaped, but With Gannon, I think like, and we kind of touched on this earlier. Like, he just gets such a longer leash than any other coach I think that got hired during this cycle, because the Cardinals are so far away from being competitive, and you can already see that the Cardinals look like they're very analytically inclined with this new regime. They took advantage of teams that discount future picks too much, and they traded for multiple first round picks, including, I think, probably the trade of draft weekend, getting the first from the Texans. And then they even took Clayton Tune, who Quinn wrote about, being on Sumersports.com, being like could be the Brock Purdy of this year. So when you can look at all of that stuff, I think, like, because Gannon can kind of get this longer runway to figure stuff out, the Cardinals can take the chance on taking someone that also needs to like grow as maybe a defensive coordinator, as maybe as a leader. And everything we've heard from coming out of the Eagles building is that people love Jonathan Gannon in that building, and I think that's a lot of signal into whether he could be successful in Arizona.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was well said, and he will get a long leash. The Bidwells are very loyal to who they bring in, so that's a good thing. And look, like, the Cardinals have had a really rough go of it since moving from St. Louis to Phoenix, and then changing their name to Arizona in '94. Like, I hope that they have a come up here. I also think Kyler Murray is very underrated. I think right now, when people are like, who's the best quarterback in the NFC, we all say Prescott, Hurts. Then we kind of pause for a second. Like, Murray's the third guy. We just forgot because he got hurt and he's had some issues with playing video games and all that kind of stuff. But make no mistake, like, Kyler Murray's good, and I hope that he can hit his ceiling there. Shane Steichen in Indy, I love this one, and I know that Indy has its problems, right? We just talked about that with and there's I like. Obviously Steichen was a guy, and I know our friend Arjun Menon, who's a Chargers fan, bless him. He was on the train with me back. He got fired in 2020 with the firing of Anthony Lynn. About halfway through that season, he became the OC and started calling plays. And Herbert was Rookie of the Year. Big, strong-armed robo guy, like, very good quarterback, and Rookie of the Year. Then he goes to Philly, and initially, and again, this is where we talk about coaching. Initially, Sirianni was calling the plays. And then eventually he's like, I can't call the plays and be a great, manager of the game. He's a great manager of the game, by the way, per our numbers at Sumer. Gives way to Steichen. Again, a very good move for Sirianni. Made me buy into Sirianni quite a bit. Steichen then takes Jalen Hurts, who's a categorically different type of quarterback, to Herbert, and gets him second in MVP voting. Goes to the Super Bowl, has the Chiefs on the ropes. Goes to Indy. They draft a player that's kind of like the hybrid Herbert Hurts player. I mean, look, he might fail. He might fail spectacularly, but in my opinion, to compete in the AFC, where your quarterbacks you're going up against are Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, Herbert, Lawrence, Aaron freaking Rodgers now, Russell Wilson if he ever regains it, down the list, they're all great. You couldn't have drafted C.J. Stroud. You couldn't have drafted Will Levis. You couldn't have signed Andy Dalton. You needed to draft Anthony Richardson and take your shot there. And I'm bullish on this. I'm very high on what the Colts did here at head coach and then subsequently their first draft pick.
Yeah, no, that was perfectly said. I think Shane Steichen is, he gets the head coach or the offensive play calling duties in Philly for a reason, and we really see the ascension of that offense after they were struggling at the beginning. And he's proven at multiple spots that he can do this. And oftentimes these head coaches get tied to the hip of whatever young quarterback is drafted that they advocated for, right? And we probably can see Shane Steichen advocating for Anthony Richardson to be the quarterback that was drafted by the Colts, because he is similar to Hurts. He's similar to Herbert. If he hits his ceiling, he could be, one of those two types of guys where from a production standpoint and just a play style standpoint. And that's a good quarterback, I think, for him to be tied to, because if it all goes well, and it is a big if, like, that is a very high level quarterback, and he could have a large part of that and get the main attribute of the success, which I think is exciting for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait for that. And then lastly, but certainly not leastly, we have D'Amico Ryans, one of the great Texans of all time, Houston Texans, former linebacker for them and also the Eagles. He goes from San Francisco to Houston. Um, they've had, Houston's been, as far as head coaches are concerned, they've had a lot of stops and starts. They've had, obviously with, they had Bill O'Brien, then went to David Culley. David Culley lasted a year. Lovie Smith lasted a year, throws him the middle finger on the way out, wins a game that robs him of a chance to draft Bryce Young. And now they go and they reportedly like wanted Will Anderson was top on their board reportedly. They get him and they get Stroud. They trade a lot of assets to get there. They draft receiver Stroud wants. They have add some veterans to the mix. A guy like Dalton Schultz, a guy that's played in the league before, been okay. They've and then Shaq Griffin, a corner they just signed, a pretty good ball player in this league. Like Houston has struggled in recent years not having star talent. Watt gone, Hopkins gone. I don't know if they've gotten talent, like they've gotten that high end talent yet, even. But I think with Stroud, there's some hope there for the first time. And I think with D'Amico Ryans, like this entire podcast has been about solving this problem. How much of D'Amico Ryans' success in San Francisco is the talent there?
Mm-hmm.
Same with Salah. And Salah's gone to New York and built a great defense. So I think that's a positive on the side of Ryans. But like when you're modeling it, like that's a ton of talent on the Niners defense, and they've done great things. And so I think an open question is how good does Ryans do in a Houston situation that isn't quite as talented? They lose some players, on the defensive front. But they play in a weaker division, right? I mean, the Jaguars are minus 160 to win that division, and they won 9 games last year. So I'm optimistic for D'Amico Ryans. I'm happy that a guy like him gets to coach a team he played for. Like, I think that's really cool. What do you think about D'Amico Ryans in Houston, Tej?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was arguably the best defensive coordinator of these past 2 seasons, looking what he did with the 49ers defense. And like the talent will always be kind of there for as a kind of an excuse for like why he was good for people that might not think he's going to do well in Houston. But at least he didn't do poorly with talent. Like at least the results were there for the 49ers defense. And Surya brings up a great point in the chat here. Jimmy Ward is going to be huge, and you can kind of see this defense get pieced together. Like they get arguably the best overall prospect in the draft in Will Anderson. They signed Jimmy Ward, and they're starting to piece together this defense where it doesn't have to necessarily get to the talent level that San Francisco is at. I think that's like a very hard task to do. But if he has a difference maker at different levels of that defense, we can see him figure it out. And he's done it many times before with really innovative game plans at the 49ers. And then I think he definitely can do it again. And, at the end of the day, like, I think that you have to be optimistic about most new hire head coaches, and sometimes like a decent amount of them don't work out, and they're so hard to project. Like we talk about how hard players are to project college to pro, like new hire coaches that we haven't seen be a head coach before is very hard to project. But I think that a lot of these head coaches are very exciting for a lot of these teams.
Yeah, and they give the fan bases something I think that was lacking, of course, which is hope, right? And hope is
Mm-hmm.
really a lot of what you're looking for in football and what you're selling to your fan base and what you're selling as far as season tickets and stuff like that. So this was a great show. I know we went a little long relative to normal, but Tej, Tej was there. Tej was a trooper. I thought this was a fun podcast topic to prep. On Wednesday, we're going to have Parker Fleming hosting the show again. He's going to have a special guest, and it'll be great. And then we're going to be back Monday. Hopefully, we'll have Thomas back Monday, but if not, we'll continue to still bring the show to you. This was a lot of fun. As I said before, Manscaped.com, Sumer as the promo code gets you 20% off. Tell somebody about the show. Subscribe, rate, and review. Help us grow the show. Help us make this the best football podcast there is. And when we get big, you can tell your friends that you were here first. So for Tej Seth,
Eric, can we got to crowdsource like a listener name for the show? so that they can kind of have that once it gets big.
Oh yeah, we got to crowdsource that. Yeah, because like when I was at PFF, we called it the Syndicate, and then Simon Hunter ruined that, and then we called it the. I love how the PFF forecast, not to drag them, but they still use like the printing press, which was my idea, but they're still using it. That's fine. You know, it lives on forever. We really thank the folks here. Great show. Colin Dunphy, who's a friend on Twitter. Great show. Congrats to Tej for getting Sumer full time. Yeah,
Appreciate it, Brandon.
We're really happy that you all came out to hang out. We'll crowdsource a show. We'll name for all of our great listeners here. We'll certainly do that. So Sumer Sports on Twitter. Send us the name so we can create a hashtag for our listeners. Okay, so for Tej Seth, for Eric Eager, this has been episode 57 of the Sumer Sports Show.